All right, I guess we'll get started. Morning, everyone. This is going to be a talk on Ansible, as you may have already seen. So, and just to give a brief overview, it's going to be kind of an introduction to Ansible. So, I'm hoping that if there's a decent split of people who have kind of heard of it, or maybe not even heard of it, but want to find out what it is, this is the place to be. But also towards the end, I'm going to toss some links out there for people who maybe are using the Ansible in the room, things that I wish I knew when I started using it about 4 years ago. I have some links in there for you and some suggestions, because it can be kind of it's pretty easy to get going with Ansible, but it's kind of a long tail with really getting something working for your system for what's going on. So my name is Gabriel Muñoz. Just occurred to me that I forgot to put my company up there. I actually work for Assurant. We're one of the sponsors here at the Perl conference. But also, I have a link up there. Link is to my slides. It is a link to a relatively recent version of my slides. So it should be pretty good. If you want to follow along, that's great. And also pull off the links from there. That'd be great. With that, before I get started, I just want to kind of poll the room. Probably be the only time I poll the room. But I'm wondering how many people in the room have used or are using currently Ansible in any capacity at all? Great. Good. That's what I wanted. What was that? Puppet? Puppet's a good tool. I'll get to that. If I have time, I was going to talk about other tools. So yeah, that's for someone who or those who don't know, there are other tools that kind of compete in the same space, but I personally think that there's pretty good overlap. So let's see if we get to it. So let's get started. What is Ansible? Well, it's kind of an automation tool that performs various things. One of the big things is obviously configuration management. So you have servers, you want to configure them. Usually that configuration is just files, right? So it's pretty good for doing stuff like that. And I'll go over some examples in a bit about that. It also does things for application deployment. Like, let's say you have a custom application, maybe that's what you do on your job or something like that, or even basic Unix or Linux services, like a cron service. Like that's something that I personally maintain as a cron service, and I do it all through Ansible. It's really good for stuff like that. It also has a lot of built-in support for cloud support, but mostly for AWS right now. But it also works for, there's actually a lot of third-party modules for things like Azure and Google Compute Cloud as well. But in the end, Ansible to me is, like, all these things are great, but the last point here for me is kind of the big thing that I'm kind of hoping to drive home here, is that Ansible is really great for service orchestration. And what do I mean by orchestration? What does that mean? To me, that means if you have more than one service that might need to communicate with each other, this is where Ansible kind of shines. So if you have, it doesn't even necessarily mean if you only have one server, that's fine, because you might have multiple services on that server. You know, it's a little simpler if you don't have multiple services on a single server for configuration management purposes. Sometimes that's the environment you have. And one of the really great things I like about Ansible is that it kind of encourages you to architect an application or an infrastructure a certain way, but doesn't require it. So there's actually a lot of built-in support for, hey, you know, however you're doing things, it's fine. And if you need to check things in a weird way, we can let you do that. But maybe the defaults won't apply. And that to me is it kind of, in my mind, it makes it a lot like Perl to me. Like, Perl is kind of like, hey, you know, you get a lot of things done with it, but there's more than one way to do it, and there definitely is with Ansible as well. So before we kind of dive into Ansible itself, I kind of want to give kind of a focus on the automation in general here before we dive into Ansible. And this to me is kind of the history of automation from my point of view. So I think a lot of people here may see this. Probably been through these experiences. So about 15 years ago, I used to manage a small cluster when I was in university, and it was between 15 and 30 nodes. And I did it mostly with like SSH. This is, in a nutshell, stuff that I did. Okay, System D wasn't around then. But you get the idea, right? You can use SSH not only to session into a server, but you can use it to just run arbitrary commands on those servers. It's great. Who doesn't use this utility? And that's what all this is showing for those of you who haven't seen it. That's all it is. It's session in as a user, add a server, and run a command, whatever that command you want. And then 15 years ago, I kind of went through my own education. It was like, hey, how could I roll my own? I kind of wrote this script like a couple days ago, and it actually does work. So let me walk through this. So it's like maybe you've been through this yourself. Maybe you have a directory called machines, and in that directory you have a bunch of files, and each file represents a server on your server farm. In this case, I have 3. And then I have a script. The script, you run the script, you give that script a name. That name is itself a script that you want to securely copy to a remote server and then run it. All right. I'm sure we've all kind of done something like this maybe. I'm going to stop right there and focus on the last 2 lines up there, the SCP and the SSH. What could go wrong there? Well, let's see here. I'm going to pick this script apart. I love this part. So the SCP command, I can tell you right now, like I'm wondering, well, I'm kind of just arbitrarily copying some name script over. Well, what if I copy the same script over, or same name script over twice, but it's not actually the same script? I'm not dealing with that here, right? It's just whatever, What about permissions? It's okay, I guess I'm copying it over as my user. That's okay. You see on the second line, I'm sudoing and then arbitrary running. What could go wrong? It's another thing, like there's no error checking. What if something actually does go wrong? I'm in the middle of a loop. What happens if I'm running something on host 1, it's successful, host 2, it's not successful? Does that mean I just continue? Who gets to decide that? And then so also like when I was managing these servers 15 years ago, I came across these interesting tools. I thought they were wonderful at the time. It just blew my mind. And it turned out that there's something called DSH, or distributed shell. And there's actually, in my research, I found 3 of them. The one that I used back then was actually the first one on that list. It's actually Perl-based. I found that out the other day. I actually put the link in there. If you want to go look at it, we're a bunch of Perl programmers. Go look at it. It's just a Perl script. The one, though, DSH is actually built into Debian, too. You just apt-get install it. That is actually the C-based one, the second one on that list. But I went ahead and installed it, and I ran this command, and it says, basically, just to read this command to you, it says, hey, run this DSH command, use SSH as a protocol to communicate, run it on 2 hosts, host 1 and host 2, and just run this command. And the command is just printing off the host name and then also the load average. And then there's that's real sample output. I ran this. And it's pretty cool, right? And yeah, but it doesn't really handle any of the errors or anything like that I already talked about. And then, so let's fast forward 15 years to today for me, real quick here. And kind of, there's this paper that I really love called Immutability Changes Everything. And the talk isn't really talking about Ansible at all. It's more at a architecture level or lower level. And I actually recommend, just if you want to expand yourself, if you've never heard of this, there is a presentation on it that I highly recommend. But also to ground ourselves in what we're trying to drive here with Ansible, there's something called the 12-factor app. And I'm not listing off the actual 12 factors here, but there's a couple of things here that I'm going to focus on as to why I'm talking about is things like we want to drive declarative format. It turns out Ansible has a declarative format. It's written in mostly YAML, which is definite pros and cons with writing what is essentially a script in YAML. Okay, I'll tell you that right now. It's nice that you don't need to worry about the formatting things, but it gets a little weird at times when you feel like you're programming in a configuration language, and that can get a little hairy, but it works. And also, like something with when you have lots of servers, or even just two is enough in my mind. You want to do things in such a way to where you're thinking declaratively, immutably, but also you want to do things in a way that will minimize the divergence across those servers, especially if they're supposed to be the same type of server. So I have a link there into 12factor.net. Go ahead, if you've never seen that, I recommend taking taking a look at it, because I think Ansible kind of goes along the lines of the ideas of the 12-factor app. So let's get into Ansible now. Some basic Ansible features. There's no installation on servers. I think this differs to some other tools like Puppet and Chef. I see some handshaking, yeah. So this to me was actually a huge selling feature to me. Obviously you have to install it on the server that you want to use it, or workstation, laptop, whatever. So there's some things that you have to deal with regards to security. But Ansible primarily does its communication to your servers over SSH. That's also a really strong thing for just getting started. You probably already have that running. If you don't, then there are other protocols for Ansible, but you probably should be using SSH. It also gives you some of the powers of SSH too. It's kind of a known quantity. When things aren't communicating well and you get SSH errors, you usually kind of know how to debug those sorts of things. And also kind of, that's also how you deal with user management as well. Do you have a user account for your automation and things like this? It kind of forces you to deal with things like this. And then of course the SSH, like the way that I use Ansible is everything is using keys with passphrases, stuff like that, so that you can. And Ansible is built up in such a way to where you can enter these into a configuration file locally, so you're not always typing it in. Because if you're running some commands across dozens or hundreds, thousands of servers, you probably want some automation around that. And of course, Ansible deals with that. Ansible is pretty big. So this third bullet point is, if you get anything out of this, load up that URL and just read through the built-in modules that Ansible has. They have hundreds built in. They're adding more all the time. I think, I forgot to look on it before I came down here, but I think they do major releases every 6 months or so, the project moves rather quickly, sometimes a little too quickly if you're trying to get stabilization on your infrastructure. But every time they release, they're usually adding more modules. So it's good to load up that URL and just browse through all the things that they can do. They have Postgres modules that I use. They have RabbitMQ modules that I use. They have basic Linux user management modules, networking things. It's pretty vast. Some of the features also that Ansible deals with that I kind of talked about in my hacky little script was it does change detection via idempotent modules. You don't get that for free though. I'll say that. So I think I've talked to a lot of people about Ansible. They're like, oh, you're using Ansible, so therefore everything is great and everything's idempotent. Well, yeah. I mean, anyone who knows a server knows that in the end, copying a configuration file isn't really idempotent. There's things that you as admins or programmers need to deal with, and I'll go over some of these examples later. But Ansible, by default, will help you deal with that in its output, and that also leads into the automatic failure detection. By default, Ansible is going to check errors for you. So the simplest way that this will happen is a lot of the built-in modules have predefined ways of how they will error, and they will tell you. Simply, if you error, it's kind of like, I think by default, if something errors, it'll just, your play will stop, but it may not stop in the way that you expect, so I'll go over that a little bit later. And lastly, Ansible is cluster aware by default. What this means is that it kind of encourages you to use lists of servers, and those servers can sometimes communicate between each other, and you can use Ansible to do that. You can run some commands on a server. You can set variables based on what happened on that server and use those on a different server through your Ansible coordination. It's really powerful. Just a couple things. May or may not be important to you. I think it is. Ansible support open source and governance. It is developed by Red Hat. I think it's developed well by Red Hat. I see an active open source community. You can go out on GitHub and see all the committers. You can open issues. Things move pretty fast in this community, and you get a lot of support online as well. There's also some enterprise support through Red Hat, and there's an Ansible Tower product that I personally have never used, but I've been told it's pretty good. But so that might be something to look into if you find it interesting. Just to let you, I gave a quick link up here because some people just want to know how do I install it. So in the end, I think that you should go to the Ansible installation screen because they actually have really good instructions for a lot of platforms. I think there are now packages built into Debian, Red Hat. Ansible is written in Python, so you can actually use pip to install it. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like cpan-m for Python. And I put at the bottom here. That's how I have my team at the very bottom here for the manually. That's how I have my team set up Ansible, and that's kind of old directions. I don't really recommend it installing it from source, but you can. It's that easy. Let's get to an example. Simplest example I could really get is on the top here. There's something called an inventory file. The inventory file is just a list of your servers. That's it. It's in an INI format or any format, and just to walk you through with it, because I'll use this example for a few slides, is that the first line there is web servers, and it's in brackets. That's a group. That's a group name. I gave it that name. You can give it whatever name you want that makes sense for you. And then after that, you can list 0 or more host names. So host 1, host 2 would be an actual something resolvable on your network or even publicly. And then you can have as many groups as you want. I have another group called database, and apparently my database is listed on host 3. Then the inventory files can actually get pretty complex. You can overlap servers into different groups. You can create groups of groups. You can create groups of groups that exclude certain servers from other groups. It can get pretty unwieldy, but in general, I recommend first trying to hash out the simplest inventory file as you can. Don't make it complicated because the error handling there isn't great if you do something wrong. But that in a nutshell is just a list of your servers. And then right below that is a simple playbook. And I'm using an Ansible terminology with playbook. This is one play with one task. Let me go line by line through this. The name first is just a name that I gave. It's whatever I want. I gave it server status, but you could write whatever. The hosts there line is a line that references my inventory file above. So I'm saying, hey, whenever you run this play, match the hosts that are in that list for web servers. All right. The thing after this, I won't dwell on this a lot. It's a place where I can add variables. In this case, I'm saying, hey, variables, go read this other file. In that file, I'm not going to show you because that's where my passwords are stored. And this is something that you wouldn't want to check into a Git repository or something like that, right? So yeah, it would just, I think that password file includes my sudo password, so that when I'm running things across my cluster and I actually do need to sudo, it'll automatically use that password for me. But then after this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. A task is a list where we can have one or more Ansible module commands. And as I mentioned before, there's hundreds built in, and one of those that's built in is something called ping. So you see that the name again is something that I gave it. I just gave it basic server availability. And ping is something built in. It's not actually ping, so it's not doing a network thing. It's actually kind of a built-in Ansible thing that says, hey, are things okay when I connect to the server? And that's it. Let's go to a second example here. So here's another. I won't go over the first few lines again. Those are going to be the same as I go through here. I'm just going to focus on the task. So here I have a different task. I gave it a name, check write access to temp. And these, by the way, are examples out of a playbook from my team that I use for validating the status of our servers. I actually do use these on a regular basis. And this one is a file module. The file module takes parameters, path, mode, state. It actually takes a bunch of other things. It's on the Ansible documentation, but these are the only 3 that I'm using. The path is just saying, hey, on this remote server, go look and temp test write access. Make sure that's there using a kind of a touch, kind of like the Unix command touch, although this is a built-in version of it. And I'm saying, hey, give the permission 066. And that's it. And then after this, the next 3 lines become user and changed when. I want to talk about those a little bit because this is where it gets to me is where it gets interesting, because I'm saying become means, hey, when you run this command, sudo over. That's what that means. It just means become root. Or Or in this case, since I have a become user, don't become root, become this user called application user. This is pretty powerful because you're able to session over to machines, sudo over to a user, maybe as your application user, and do things that your application could do as if you had sessioned onto that server and done it appropriately yourself. So this is a thing where, remember, you're managing servers. You should be doing this securely, right? So Ansible does go through quite a few hoops to try to encourage you to do that correctly, and this is one of them. So you see become user quite a bit in some of these examples that I have. The last line here, changed when, is, and I set it to false, is basically Ansible will always do change detection for you. So this is a module where it would accurately be able to know as to whether or not it actually touched the file or not. If any of you have ever used the Unix command touch, you actually, whenever you touch a file, it actually does always modify that file, I believe, and so does this. So if I was to actually run this over and over again, even if the file already existed, it would always touch it, it would always tell me that it changed. This changed when line tells, I'm able to go in there and say, you know what, ignore that status. Just pretend like it didn't change, because I don't care. Wield that with power, because this is the case where I truly didn't care about whether or not it changed. I only cared about whether or not it was successful or not. So let's go to another example. A little bit of a smaller example, but here's and I'm going to skip down to the task section here again. I gave it a name. This is a name that I gave, and this is also a real way to test whether an investment was alive. Because we had some problems once where NFS kind of went down, and we're like, what's going on? And we couldn't figure it out too quickly, and this is how we automated it. And this shows the power of, if there isn't a built-in command, you have a shell command, and you can just write shell code, or bash, or I think you can actually specify as a parameter to this command what shell you want to invoke. It's pretty powerful. But this is also kind of brings up some of those issues that I showed earlier in my hacky script. Like, well, if you're just arbitrarily running shell, are you checking errors correctly? How do you know when it changed? You do have all these problems here as well. So you actually have to deal with that. So one of the things that the Ansible does by default is that it's going to check the error status for this command by itself. I didn't actually have to say so. I can override it, but to me the default here is okay, and it's what I wanted. You can see also that I used a changed when false again, because in the end I wasn't really modifying anything on the server. That's important. Like I wasn't touching anything in the NFS mount. I wasn't creating a file. Wasn't doing anything else. It should be a rather idempotent action. Let's go to another example here. Is that I wanted to show that tasks actually can compose together. So there's no new task here that I haven't already showed you. These are the exact same tasks. They're just put one right after the other. So this is one play running 3 tasks in order. So the way that I would read this is that, okay, let's say I think in my example for my inventory, I had 3 web servers. So Ansible is going to run this play. It's going to see, oh, you have 3 web servers. Then it's going to say, oh, you have 3 tasks that need to be run on each of these web servers. It's going to concurrently connect to each of those servers, so concurrently at the same time, and it's going to run each task on each of those servers independent of each other, and do its status checks like I mentioned before, whether it changed or not, whether it errored or not. And it'll give you output for each server, like, yeah, this changed and this is okay, this changed and this is okay, and etc. So the key here is that this single play will run each of these commands concurrently across all of those 3 servers. That's the key there. So I'm going to go to the next slide here and show you the same task. It's the same 3 tasks, but across 3 different plays, and it would just look like this. So what's the difference here? The difference is pretty key, and the difference, I guess, is I'm going to say this is actually saying, okay, I have 3 plays. Each play happens to have 1 task, but it could have as many as I want. That was mostly for space and time here. I compressed it as much as I could. And it's going to say, okay, so first play, I'm going to, across excuse me, I have 2 web servers. Across 2 of my web servers, I have my ini file up there again to help me out. Across both my web servers, ping them at the same time. And something key here will happen is that, let's say that there's a problem with host 2 pinging it. Let's say there's just a lot of lag, and it takes 20 seconds to ping, but the first one takes 1 second to ping. The play will actually hold before it goes to the next play, the temp status, for all of them to complete. And this is where the orchestration kind of happens. It's pretty cool that I can do as many tasks as I want, and I know at the end of that play, it's just going to stop and wait for all of them to complete. And completion doesn't just mean does it finish to run. It actually it'll do the error checking. If there's an error, your play may actually stop or your playbook, I should say, will actually stop for that server, but will continue for your other servers. So this is, and you can control whether or not you want them all to stop or not, or if you want to ignore errors, you can control all of this dynamically. But this is kind of the key thing here. It's going to go across ping all web servers, which may not be a very useful thing to do, but for example purposes, there you go. Then it's going to go to the next play, and it's going to say, okay, for all of these web servers to go ahead and test the temp directory access. And if any one of those has lag or takes a long time, it's going to wait for all of them to complete. And it's going to move on to the next one. This one I kind of threw a little kink into, and I actually changed the host there for database. It's actually only going to run on the database server. It's not going to run on your web servers. And so you may actually wonder, like, well, why would you do that? Why would you run 2 plays on these 2 servers, have them wait, and then run them on a third server that is not even the same server? It's like, well, maybe your database server for this play needed services or configuration on your other servers for it to work, right? So this is where you get the, oh, that could have gone wrong. So this is where you get the orchestration between services. And so basically, I know definitively with this playbook that nothing will happen on that database server unless these other plays worked.
So
yes.
So what you're saying there is that if web server 2 was down, and when we ran the ping, it would fail the ping, so it would continue with temp status, but only for host 1.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the question being if one of the pings on the web servers failed, it will keep continuing on for host 1. Yes. Yeah. And you can change this behavior, actually. This is the default behavior. So yeah, it's because sometimes if you think about it, like what if ping was something really important and it failed, and it would still run my database action? Maybe that's not what you wanted, right? So that's that's and that's the power of Ansible too. Is sometimes you want to do that, sometimes you don't. It really depends on what you're doing. It depends on the idempotency of it, right? And that's actually the answer of it too. If you're doing something super special on your database, let's say like this, you do actually, in my opinion, want it to run all the way through. So if you really do have a hard dependency on a database and other thing, you should explicitly point it out and say, oh, this is really important. I need to do a special validation here. And you can do that with a shell or something custom. I actually think I have an example of this later. Good question. So there are some examples of Ansible. In a nutshell, that's kind of the simplest way to get things done is just to use tasks. But they have other abstractions, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the abstractions. I'm not even going to show any examples because it's a little bit more. Honestly, you don't need them to get going. However, you do need them to make your code reusable or abstracted in a great way. So I'll just go over it a little bit. The tasks you've already seen, and the tasks you can kind of see as the lowest common denominator of work in Ansible. And a lot of times those are just built-in modules, shell commands that you made, or something like that. They can use anywhere, but they're difficult to kind of compose together, especially if you're trying to compose services like that example was actually difficult to compose those things together. That would be my argument. But there's also something called roles, and roles are kind of like to me, tasks are kind of like, in the Perl idiom, it would be like kind of like a script. Roles in the Perl idiom, it would be kind of like using Moose. It gives you a structure to your task. And so roles, you can actually put a whole bunch of stuff in there. You can put variables you can set. You can put templated files. You can put arbitrary files that you want that maybe you want to copy over. But you can also put as many tasks as you want and in whatever order you want. And then in your plays, you can just compose them using a single name by the role name. So that it's pretty powerful, but it's a little bit more confusing as to how to organize your code when you start to use them. And playbooks you saw already it's kind of like the top level orchestration. That's usually you actually can run Ansible. There's a command Ansible that you can run one-liners. I don't use it a lot. Most likely you're not going to if you're using Ansible for anything real. You're probably going to be using a command called Ansible Playbook, and you run that on some of the examples that I've had here, and the playbooks are kind of like in my mind, they're kind of like a checklist, and that's also the power of it. If you think of a play, you think, what are the 5 things that I need to do when we're having some sort of production incident? Like, you put them into play, and it's basically a checklist of things to go off, and if the error checking, if something goes wrong, it'll go red, and it's really easy to see. That's kind of the power of a playbook. So a couple other things I wanted to go over because I found it really useful was I actually use Vagrant and Ansible together. Vagrant actually has support for it, and here's an actual working example that I pulled. I minified it to be so that it would fit on the screen. But I actually use this. I use RabbitMQ at work, and this is a simple way to spin up RabbitMQ box locally, and then ask Vagrant to dynamically generate an inventory file. That's what the bottom method is. And this is in Ruby, by the way, or a Vagrant file syntax, and it's pretty cool because it'll use the definition from Vagrant itself, which is building your machine dynamically. It'll then use the machine names and the ports and everything that Vagrant generated and dynamically generate an Ansible inventory for me. And then I can even run it too. And I actually have Ansible.playbook here. I think towards the bottom, RabbitMQ-playbook.yaml, it'll go run that. And that could be whatever I want. Maybe I built a server, but it's not doing anything. And then this playbook could just apt-get install RabbitMQ and maybe copy over a config file, and then suddenly I got RabbitMQ running in a way that's defined for me for my application environment. I'm going to show what that would look like in the next slide right here. So this is a real example that I pulled that Vagrant generated for me. There's an inventory file right at the top there. So you see a group name at the bottom, then a server name, and then you actually see some variables set for me that Vagrant did for me. It's like, hey, the server name RabbitMQ has this actual SSH host name and this port and this SSH user, and it did it all for me. I didn't have to do any of this myself. And then here's our quick playbook at the bottom here it uses a task that there's an apt Ansible command. I use it a lot. I run on Debian, and we use Debian packaging for all of our application installations. And it's that simple. So here's a simple way. It's like, hey, invoke apt and install RabbitMQ-server. I actually don't know if that's the package actually in Debian apt repository. I kind of just wrote that randomly. But this is a way to do it. And then there's at the bottom there, you can see I use it become, which means do it as root. You kind of have to install packages as root. And then there's a notify there that you can use to restart the servers. And it would only restart the service if it actually changed anything there. All right. Which is also some of the powers of change detection. If on change, you can say, hey, go do this other action, or not if it didn't change. So I wanted to give some examples here of some of the other modules because it's really powerful. And right up top there is cpanm is the Ansible module. And in the end, it is just invoking cpanm, so you need to have cpanm installed. You could do that as a shell command as well, but there is an Ansible built-in module for it. There's a whole bunch of options. You only see me using one named Modulicious, but there's a whole bunch that you can find. But then I pulled some things actually that I use at work too. The second example is this an arbitrary shell command. It's actually using the netkit command to check to see if a firewall port is open. And the cool thing about that is that I can, with Ansible, I'm not showing here the hosts here, but with Ansible, let's say I have 20 servers that need access to that database server. With Ansible, you can say, hey, just go run this on each of these 20 servers and show me if it really is open. Don't show me if it's open on the machine that I'm running Ansible on. No, that's not useful. I want to know what the status is of my actual environment. And the techdb command here that I have, I'm going to talk. There's actually 3 things here too. I also used register, failed when, and changed when. And this is also some of the customizations that you can use Ansible. Register means, hey, register a variable called result. And by default, Ansible is going to say, okay, I'm going to store everything that results from the output of the shell into this result. It turns out I have access to things like the return code. On the next line here, failed when, I can say result.return code, or RC, is not equal to 0. Fail when that happens, which I think is the default. But there's an explicit way to do it. You also have access to things here like standard out, standard error. You also have access to each line in those streams as well. So you can iterate through the lines and check for things. I think there's actually a handful of things that you get access to when you register a variable like this, and it's super powerful for when you're dealing with services that you maybe don't have control over. Somebody else wrote them. Maybe they weren't thinking about idempotency or automation at all, and you kind of like, well, I have to figure out how this actually worked. And so this is one of the ways where if you really need to, you can really dive into the details and parse out your results. And also, again, you see that I use a changed when, and I'm saying pretty much never tell me that this changed. I was only interested in this case for error handling. Next example was a built-in module for Postgres. I use Postgres at work, and it turns out that Postgres has quite a few built-in modules in Ansible. And you can add roles, you can create databases, you can drop databases. You may not want to do that in automation, or if you do, know what you're doing. But that's kind of a pretty cool. I thought my team used to do a lot of the Postgres setup manually. In fact, we still do a lot of it manually. But when I found out that it was there, I'm like, oh, why didn't I check that it was there? I don't know when Ansible included in its default module, but it's really powerful. The last example here is I want to go over with. I have another example. I don't know if I get time to get to it though. Is that configuration management. There's a built-in command called template, and template is pretty powerful because it can basically, you can tell it to, hey, go look for a template that you checked in, that you created yourself locally, copy it over to the server, but fill in with any variables that you find in that template with data that you've defined in Ansible. I didn't go with that. We'll see if I get to a better example of that. But I also wanted to show you one of the cool things with Ansible and the template command here that I show here is that it has a validate command too, which is pretty cool, especially for sudoers, which is why I wanted to show it. If you ever, I don't know how many people have ever modified your sudo file and then locked yourself out. Well, yeah, it happens. And here's a way, like built in Ansible, to use visudo to test to see if it actually worked. And you can use arbitrary things in the validation here as well. It's pretty powerful. So one thing I want to talk about too, I learned a lot by looking at third-party modules for how to write Ansible things in a generic way. There's something called Ansible Galaxy. There's an Ansible Galaxy command that's deployed or is part of the Ansible package for you. But you yourself or anyone can write a module and upload it to the system. It's a lot like CPAN. It's very much like CPAN. Surprise, surprise. And so here's a way to install things. Ansible Galaxy install, then username dot role name. Username is whoever uploaded it, and the role name is whatever the name of the package that the person gave it. An example that I personally use is a service called Graylog. It's a log aggregation service. It's kind of a complicated service, actually. It uses MongoDB for, I think, its internal configuration, but it also uses Elasticsearch for the searching of its messages, right? So if you think about it operationally, or as from a system in point of view, in order for me to deploy Graylog, I not only need to install a Graylog service, but I need to install all these other services too. And it was kind of confusing when I was trying to figure that out. And I went to Ansible Galaxy, found this role that does it for me, and it's pretty informative because you also have to install the JVM, and I found, and then from this module I actually learned how to write a role that would be usable both on Debian and Red Hat. These are things that you can do in Ansible. So if anything, know that Ansible Galaxy is there. I think I have a warning down at the bottom, like, know what you're installing on your servers. Ansible Galaxy, it's pretty nice utility. Most modules, if not all, will have links to GitHub or where the source is. You can go look at it. People can star the modules. You can see how often it got downloaded, things of this nature. It's a pretty nice utility. So I went over some of the Ansible tooling already. The Vagrant dynamic inventory was pretty useful. It's a bit more advanced, but know that it's there for you. And there's more than one way to do it, actually. I have a link there, TinyCC. It's just a link to the Ansible documentation and how to generate your own inventories. Sometimes why would you want to do this? If you're in a cloud environment, if you don't know what your servers are going to be when you're deploying, you might need to do it dynamically. I work in an environment where I know definitively my servers. They don't change that often. So I have inventory files checked in with all of our servers, and that's kind of the source of truth for it. Or I try to make it the source of truth anyway. But there's also really good support for Docker built in to Ansible. So if any of you are using Docker or even want to look into it, I actually recommend checking out the book Ansible Up and Running. It's been recently updated, and the recent update, the second edition, actually dives in pretty good into the Docker support in Ansible. And it's pretty nice too, because you can just do your own thing in Docker. If you do use it, you can just do your own thing, and then you can come in with Ansible later to kind of orchestrate it together if that's something that makes sense for your situation. I also will mention that you can write your own commands or modules in Python. So a lot of the built-in commands, if not all of them, are written in Python. So you can do that yourself. If you're doing something super custom, you have that power, but it's an advanced thing. So you probably try not to do it, but if you do, it's there. So here's a list of things that I kind of wish I had when I was starting out. So we're going to get into this towards the end here. I'll ask for questions in a second, but again, I'll reference the module index. If anything, go to the module index, go look at what it can do, and see if it matches for your situation. One of the more recent things that has been added to Ansible, actually, I'll mention it, is that it has, I think about a year ago or so, a lot of support was added for routers. Specifically, I know it has support for F5s. I know in my business we use F5s. I'm not in charge of them, so I've never got a chance to use the Ansible with it, but I really wanted to. So if you're in a situation where you deal with networking on your site, I would recommend going and look to see if they even have support for the things that you use. Maybe it'd be something that you could use. There's some pretty good tutorial on a site called Service for Hackers. Here's a link to it. I recommend if you want to go through end-to-end something, get it working, to understand this is something that makes sense to me. That's a really good tutorial. So the best practices is something that it took me a while to realize even existed on the Ansible site. I think it's been out there for as long as I've been using it. I just didn't know it existed. So I wanted to point out that even if you're getting started, I highly recommend looking at the Ansible best practices. It just tells you, here's how to lay out your playbooks and your tasks and stuff like that, because you probably struggle with that a lot. I know I did. It'll tell you, like, just create your inventory files like this and it'll work. But it also has options. There's actually different best practices that you can follow based on the scope of your project. I work on a project that kind of ballooned out, and we got into trouble with how to organize our own code, and the best practices actually helps with that a lot. Another thing I found more recently, and it's a bit more advanced, so if you're already using Ansible, I think there are a few. If you haven't seen, there's actually a pretty good talk by some Red Hat developers. They're like, hey, these are pretty much things that we've seen a lot, like almost everyone run into with regards to just getting going in Ansible or even advanced things. And there's a video that's a link to. I highly recommend that. A couple of things that I did use excessively is, I've already mentioned Ansible Up and Running. Excellent book. It's maybe 200 or 300 pages. It's small enough to where you could get going with something even in a couple of days with that book, and that's what I did. Thanks. Also, I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see that there is integration with Vagrant. So the Vagrant book is it's a little older, but if any of you have ever used it or have not used it, I recommend checking into it. And also Docker Up and Running. If you're into Docker, I found that the Docker Up and Running book to be pretty useful. Any questions? It's a cute dog, right? Yeah.
So at the beginning you said Ansible is for config management, and there are like dozens of config management like Puppet or Chef. When Ansible is good and not good?
So when is Ansible good and not good when compared to these other tools, right? Other tools. Let's prep for that. So in the end, Ansible, some of the benefits of Ansible is that it's agentless, right? So I think that right there is one of the answers. But also, in my opinion, there's overlap too, because sometimes you want to use Puppet or Chef for your configuration management. So maybe it doesn't make sense to use Ansible for that since you're already doing it, but it might make sense for some simpler things for orchestrating on those things along the side. That's where I've seen it useful. But then again, if it's a difficult question to answer, right? Because if you're in an organization that they're standardized on Puppet or something like that, you should probably try to use that. But in which case, the power of Ansible may just come into how to do things when you just want to do something simple. Or one of the things that I've been really successful with Ansible is in the middle with a production incidents, using Ansible to assess what's really wrong. Because I could session around to 20 or 30 servers, maybe, but it's still going to take me a little while. And if you're good enough with Ansible, you could write it right there in the playbook and run it in a few minutes. And I actually found it pretty useful in actual incidents, which maybe Puppet or Chef wouldn't be useful for that, depending on telemetry that you already have, right? So I do find Ansible pretty useful for running simple things and just collecting data and pushing that data to like a database or something like that. That's a little bit more advanced, but that is something that Ansible can do as well. Good question.
And the link is SSH access, right? That's basically, that's all just how it's doing it. If you can SSH
Yep.
onto that box, you can Ansible onto that box.
Yes. So the question is it really SSH based fully? And yeah, if you can SSH onto a box, you can use Ansible to get on it. Yep. And that's also one of the big pros, I think, in terms of getting up and running. It was with my team. It was an easy win.
Well, and the other one too, with Puppet, you gotta get pretty involved with doing, some horizontal push.
Yep.
Here, it's a lot more on the fly.
Yeah.
It can.
It is. It's a lot more on the fly with Ansible, or it's definitely a pro until it isn't, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions?
Is there support for Windows?
Oh, is there support for Windows? Actually, there is some in the more recent versions of Ansible. I personally have never used it, and the support is the number of modules that you have access to are much smaller, but you do have a growing number of. I think I was just looking at it yesterday. I think I saw Windows modules for Ansible for like access control lists, files, and configurations, simple things like that. There's actually a dedicated section on the Ansible documentation. If you're on Windows, I recommend going to their site and looking at exactly what support they have for Windows to see if it fits for all the things that you need.
But you still have to run Ansible on Muñoz.
Do you?
Almost certainly, yes, but you can run a container on Windows which will give you an Alpine kernel and so on and so forth. So you can still do it.
Yeah, the question is, do you have to still run Ansible in Linux? And honestly, I don't know. I would be surprised if they rolled out Windows support with and required you to run it on a non-Windows machine. I would have to look, to be honest. It's good. I'm not sure. I don't run it on a Windows environment, but I have been asked several times. I should know, but I don't. I think that's all. I think that's all we have time for. Thanks.